All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Codementor Office Hours. My name is Wei Ting. I'm part of the Codementor team. Today's guest expert, we're super excited to have Steve Klabnik here with us today.
Hey, everybody.
So as all of you may know, Steve is an active Ruby on Rails contributor as well as a regular conference speaker. So today, Steve is going to talk with us about working on open source, among other issues. So Steve, please take away.
Yeah, so I want to get mostly right into discussion, but a teeny little bit more background about why I'm the person being asked the questions of. So basically, I've been doing open source professionally for the last 3 or 4 years. I currently work for Mozilla on the Rust programming language, writing documentation, so all of that work is 100% open source. I previously worked at Balance Payments, where I did a lot of advocacy stuff, but also worked on our testing infrastructure and things, which was 100% open source, and like communicated our open source code to other people. And then a couple years before that, I worked for Jumpstart Labs, teaching people programming and working on Ruby open source stuff full time. So I've been involved in a lot of open source projects over the years. Some of them are near irrelevant, like my own little tiny personal projects that people don't care about. Some of them are massive, like Ruby on Rails, or Rust is becoming increasingly important. So I mostly wanted to answer questions about what it's like. People are always asking me, how do I get an open source? What do I do? What's it like? All these kinds of things. So I want to hear from all of you about what your problems, questions, concerns, interests are, and we can talk about it. So I'm going to shut up now. What do you want to hear about?
Hi Steve, this is Dipender. Yeah, so
What's up?
So like the first doubt which I have when I start working on open source is how to choose which open source to work. Some are very big in which you submit a commit and it takes months and weeks for the main contributor even to look at your commit, and then eventually when he see your code review, at that time you lose interest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, I think it's one of the things is you can't make it an abstract goal. Like if you say I want to start working on open source, that's too open-ended, which means you'll fail. I've always found that I succeed when I define very specific goals for myself. So the way that I like to do things, and how one of the things that got me started in doing this stuff was, so for example, Rails, I guess I should say. So I started working on Rails, even though I've been doing previous open source work, because I had a bug in Rails. I ran into it in one of my applications, and I opened a ticket, and they said, yes, this is definitely a bug. And I said, cool, maybe I can fix this. And so I tried looking into it, and it didn't work. But I learned a bunch about some internals, and so I said, oh, I like writing documentation. They need help with docs. And so I started writing documentation. But by picking a specific project that I was using already, I think is super useful. So I think if you don't use a project, you don't know where the pain points are, and you don't know where help needs to happen. And so there's sort of a weird chicken and egg thing, right? When you don't know a whole lot about a project, you're simultaneously really valuable because you're the person that they need to know how to improve from. But if you don't know about it, it's hard to get involved, right? So I've always tried to pick a specific project and try to pick a specific objective, and then get that done, and then it sort of builds from there. My first commit took me a long time to work on. My second commit took me a little less time. My third commit took me a little less time. And now, it doesn't take a long time at all, but that's only because of practice. So, yeah. Tad is on mute, but he asked in chat, how do I make my first commit to a large project without getting it rejected? So all large projects are different, but if a project is a certain size, they usually have contributing guidelines. So GitHub tried to address this with their whole contributing.md document, but even the Linux kernel has a how to contribute guide. And so the biggest thing you can do to not get rejected is to look through all those things and make sure that your commit follows those rules. It's sort of one of the tensions in working on a big project is that you receive a lot more, so to you, your patch is special and it's the only one. To a maintainer, it's one of a ton of patches that need reviewed. So a lot of this bureaucracy around open source is designed to make it manageable for maintainers to deal with patches. And so one of the big things that happens a lot is oh, this does not have tests. Please add some tests, and then I can look at this again. And so, that each project has different rules, but if you follow those rules, you're like 85% of the way. And then the last little bit, the maintainer will actually give you more specific advice about, oh, maybe we prefer to do it this way. Oh, there's something over here. But just like excessive communication, the more you talk about it, the less likely it is to get rejected. The patches I end up having to turn down are the ones where people submit a patch, and then I ask them a couple questions or look about some feedback, and then 6 months later they haven't said anything. And so then I say, well, sorry, I can't accept this, and close it. So I think that like excessive communication is the best way to like get a big patch in, or to start getting a patch in, I guess.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, let's do it.
I've been using Ruby on Rails since 2 years now, and the thing participating or contributing to Ruby on Rails repository is just like a dream for me. It looks so far to me, but maybe it's a little bit basic, essential question. How to start getting involved in open source projects? Where to start?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Rails is that it is used by tons and tons of people, and it is pretty big. But the number of active contributors to Rails is actually pretty small. So if you look at, there's actually a Rails contributors like app that we have, and it keeps track of who is actually committed and who is doing what and what your like scoreboard is. And so it's contributors.rubyonrails.org, and I'll paste this link into the chat too. But it keeps track of like the number of commits. And what I've always really loved about this particular graph is that if you scroll the whole way down to the bottom, the very, very last name on that list, well, it's not anymore, I guess. Oh no, it used to be. So the last name used to be Y the Lucky Stiff with one patch into Rails. And he was like a super well-known Rubyist back in the day, and he only had one commit. So like even these, famous quote-unquote programmers, or the people that you would like think do a whole lot of stuff, don't necessarily contribute a whole lot. So in terms of getting started, it's about finding something that is achievable. So with Rails, there's a lot of open bugs. I think that last time I checked, there was like 700 or 800 open issues, and some of those are very hard, and some of those are very easy. So you just sort of have to like pick one and then work on it. And it can take a long time, and sometimes it can be very frustrating, but it only gets easier as you go along. So like basically what I would do is I would set aside an afternoon, and I would just look at this bug and I'd try to figure out what's going on. Even providing reproductions for bugs is really useful. So even if you're not qualified to fix a bug, or if you struggle with a bug and you say, okay, this is a little too hard, I'm not going to be able to fix it, saying here's a sample Rails app that demonstrates this bug, you can just run rake test and it will fail and you can see what's happening. That is so useful to people who do have more advanced knowledge or more advanced contributors, because sometimes it can just take an hour to get a reproduction set up. Someone will report a bug and they'll say, my thing fails in this circumstance, and then that's all their bug report says. But having an executable test case, or even just an app that reproduces it, like, load up this Rails app and go visit, the home page, and it will show you the bug. Like that is super, super useful to people who, are also other contributors as well. So that's a great way to get started. I am a huge fan of documentation writing, but a lot of people aren't. And docs are a really easy, low-hanging fruit way to get in. But the problem is a lot of people find it very boring. So I don't. So I like it as a way, but it's not right for everybody. But it's really easy to find documentation that's very small, and then just figure out where it is in the code base, and then write a couple sentences explaining what this method does, and then submit that. And that can be a really low-key way of getting involved too, if doing docs does not bore you out of your mind. Because as a beginner, as a new person to Rails, you are in the best position to explain why something is not a good explanation. So there's also that too, I guess. But yeah, like going through the issues list for Rails is really good, because those are all bugs that people have already filed.
Thank you.
There's a question that was also pasted in the chat too. How do you manage your time and attention between so many simultaneous projects and avoid the tendency to mix up code on different projects? So the answer is that it's interesting and multifaceted, actually. So if I only worked on one project, I would get very little done. I find motivation by switching between projects all the time. I joke that I'm massively parallel. Like, I need to be doing tons of different things in order to stay motivated. So I'll work on one thing one day, and then another thing the other day, and another thing the next day. The other flip side of this question is that sometimes it may look like I have my stuff together on all these different projects, but also a lot of times I don't. So, for example, I was at a conference last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever, and someone gave a talk about a gem that I helped maintain, and they said, you should use active model serializers. Like, Steve is in the audience, and he's actually one of the maintainers. And we had a joke because afterwards, 3 or 4 of the people in the audience came up to the speaker, and they were like, Steve hasn't really been doing a good job of maintaining that gem lately. There's been pull requests open for 2 months with no comments. Should we still use this gem or not? So it can look sometimes like I am doing a wonderful, perfect job of maintaining all these gems, but actually I am not, and that's a secret. Don't tell anybody. So like Rescue, for example, I haven't contributed to Rescue in a couple of months. Or even Rails. Like, I haven't had an actual commit into Rails in quite a while at this point. So it can look that way from the outside, but on the inside, I usually feel like I am not doing great work on all my gems and stuff. And sometimes this is true too, right? So for example, 2 months, you could say that that's stable. I had a discussion recently about Draper, another gem I maintain, where people said, like, is Draper abandonware? There hasn't been a commit in 2 months. And I was like, no, it's just relatively stable. Like, most of the problems are worked out. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's working as intended. So a lot of times that can happen too. And then also there's projects where, I am technically the maintainer of, but I don't do any active work on it anymore. So Shoes is a great example of this, the GUI desktop toolkit for Ruby. I have not had a single line of code in Shoes 4, the next version that's almost out, that's being worked on for the past year. I am just on the team because I used to work on Shoes a lot, and so I'm there to like help with discussion and stuff. But it would be wrong for Shoes to be my project at this point. It's other people's project, but my name is still on the team's list. So people imagine, I assume, that I have a much bigger impact on that than I actually do. So that's also part of, I guess, the secret as well, is like once you have a successful project and other people are working on it, you're still like are left on the team even if you don't do active work. Out of respect for your previous work or whatever. So definitely, I do work on quite a bit of things, but I am not necessarily as good as it might look like. The last thing is, because all of my work has been open source for years, it may look like I do more work than other people, but that's only because all of my work is publicly available. If you have a day job where you worked on closed source stuff, you probably have as many or more commits on your projects as I do. It's just that mine are up all on GitHub and yours are in a private repository somewhere. So the visibility aspect is also different too. Yeah.
Is Choose what you have on Git as donor choose?
No, so Shoes is like the footwear, SHOES.
Oh.
Shoes is there's a shoesrb.com, I think is the .com we put up for it. It's a GUI toolkit from Ruby that Why the Lucky Stiff originally wrote a very long time ago that I sort of inherited from him when he left. Donors Choose is a gem that wraps the Donors Choose API that I sort of got started, and a couple people have like contributed a bunch of code to, because the old gem was for their old API, and we were using it as an example at work. And so they asked me to start wrapping it up. And so I did I did enough function calls for the example we were trying to provide, and then said, hey, if anybody else wants to contribute, please chip in. And some people did, and then I ignored it for a while because I suck.
The same question from the audience, like could you outline the benefits you have had from so many open source projects, like the learning, or like how do you support yourself?
Yeah, so some of that answer is that I have had very generous employers. So my Jumpstart Lab, for example, did not get direct benefit from me working on open source, but they still paid me a salary anyway. And so that's because Jumpstart wanted to be seen as someone who's contributing to the Ruby ecosystem. So by employing me, having me get up on stage, that was enough to convince them that that was worthwhile. the other flip side is, I guess, I also, in my jobs working on open source, have gotten paid a lot less than if I worked for a private company doing closed source work as well. So that's also part of it too. So while they were generous in paying me, I was making enough to pay all my bills, and I was very happy with my salary, but it was not as much as if I had been very ruthless, cutthroat about finding a job with a maximum amount of salary. So open source jobs, there is ways to get some money off of them, but they tend to pay a little bit less, and you have to be okay with that. And I decided that I would prefer to work on open source and make less money than I would working on closed source and trying to maximize the amount of money. But most of the benefits that I've had have been intangible ones, not monetary ones. So for example, because I work on open source, I get to speak at a lot of conferences because people are interested in what I have to say because I work on these things. And so that has allowed me to travel the world on other people's money, which is an incredible gift that I am just, it's been amazing to go so many places. I didn't leave my home state until I was in the end of high school, and I didn't go to the West Coast ever until I was in college. And so I didn't travel at all, and now I've almost filled up a passport in the last 2 years. And so that has been an incredible gift and benefit from doing open source. And the corollary of that is now I have friends all over the world that I know now that I wouldn't have had in open source. Like at this point, I have more friends from the open source world than I do from any of my hobbies or any of the like real world meat space stuff that I do, which is kind of cool too. And that's definitely made me a much better person because of the experience to other cultures. Americans are so insular; we don't travel outside of the States so much that I think that I understand the rest of the world a lot better because I've been lots of places. So I'd say that's the biggest benefit of open source for me has been friends, definitely, and being able to travel because it's something I love doing, but I would never be able to afford on my own.
And like one more question, like how do you initiate an open source project? Like if you have some project in mind, like you see a problem in Ruby and you can see like there can be a jam for this. Like you start the first commit by yourself and then like ask people to join you, or like you just first outline the aim of the project and then ask people without even committing for the project.
So the funny part about open source is that the vast majority of the time, no one will actually care about what you're doing, and that's like a blessing and a curse. So, for example, I have a ton of repositories in GitHub that have like 1 or 2 watchers, and you just never know what will be useful and not useful. So, so what I like to do is I just make the project myself, and I do exactly what I want, and then I release it on Ruby Gems in the case of Ruby stuff, or I put it up on GitHub, or wherever is appropriate for the language I'm working in, and then I usually just either tweet about it, or I tell other people that I know that are friends, like, hey, I'm working on this thing. Or so for example, Ruby Weekly is a really great place to promote your Ruby open source projects. Peter Cooper's email list. He doesn't publish everything, but he is always looking for things to publicize. And so just like telling people about it, and sometimes everyone will be like, this is amazing and wonderful, and other times no one will care. And so the nice thing about no one caring is that you can do whatever you want, but I would definitely say that it's hard to get attention on your project, but if you solve a real need, then people will come along and help out. And the other thing too is I don't think open source has to be a big public, everyone knows you've built this thing. If you build something and you share your code and one other person cares, that's a win as far as I'm concerned. Because for me, open source is about helping other people not have to do the same work over and over and over again. So like I do open source projects for the help, and that's actually what my motivation to work on bigger projects is. I can help more people at once. But as far as I'm concerned, little projects are oftentimes just as fun, if not more fun, than big projects. Because with big projects, you have to like argue online for hours with other people about certain kinds of changes. If you want to make a big change to a big open source project, there's a lot of non-programming work that goes into that. And when you have a little project that's owned by yourself that other people don't care about, you can just code all over the time. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to ask anyone's permission. And that is its own reward in some ways too. So I don't think that you should always shoot for the biggest possible projects, because even if one other person uses it, it's you've helped someone else, so you won.
Yeah, like, actually it's something like this only. You feel very frustrated going to IRC asking every people, is it the right commit? Like all the tests are passing, why you're not accepting it? Then people will say they'll reply to this back and you see
Yeah,
now. um,
and you also just never know what like is going to be useful to other people. So for example, the most popular gem that I ever created myself is called Request Store, and I wrote it in like 3 hours at 4 a.m. when I had jet lag from traveling to some conference, and I wrote this little tiny gem. It's like 30 lines of code and like 20 lines of tests, and I wrote it up and I released it at 5 a.m. that morning or whatever, and now it has something like 600,000 installs or something. And that gem is more popular than all of these big projects I've poured hours and hours of time and effort into, that I've like done all this work to promote, and I've like done all these things. And so like I just happen to get lucky with this one particular small project, but I always laugh because I try to remember, like, just because you pour your time and effort into it doesn't mean that people will use it, and just because you didn't pour time and effort into it doesn't mean people won't use it. Like, those two things are totally disconnected. So sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But small projects are just as valuable as good ones, just for different reasons. Okay, so somebody else asked on chat. From software management perspective, what are some of the things that you've learned that you can share being involved in so many big open source projects? So one of them that I've learned is the value of having tests. This was a big thing for me coming to the Ruby world. I worked in other programming languages before Ruby, and Ruby's obsession with testing from like a software management perspective is super, super valuable. But tests won't actually save you. So this is a good example of, again, of like me failing as a maintainer. I released a version of Rescue that was completely and utterly broken to 30,000 people. This is like about 30,000 people download every version of Rescue. And this is because my tests all passed, so I released it. But it turns out that we were using Forwardable, which is in the Ruby standard library, but the test framework required Forwardable, but the actual code didn't require Forwardable. So all my tests passed, so I said, cool, this small patch is good, let's push this out. But it actually broke the production code, and because I forgot to try the actual gem, it was just terribly broken. It failed on require when you tried to start it up. So I've learned that tests are very valuable, but they're also not infallible either. The other software management thing I think that I've learned is that sometimes there is a lot of bureaucracy involved in working on big projects, but that bureaucracy exists for a reason. And that's because it's like so difficult to keep up with bigger projects that they need to require tests, they need to require documentation, they need to require that you follow style guidelines, because that's the only way to manage a big project. And it definitely can feel like a lot of work at times, and sometimes you're like, this is just a tiny patch, why do I need to go through all this like extra work that doesn't matter? But it actually does matter. The other thing that I've learned too is that you can definitely have too much complexity. So I was a big fan of the workflow that's called Git Flow for a while. Now I'm sort of not really as into it because I think that it adds too many branches, and I prefer what's like GitHub Flow nowadays, which is a simpler version that basically is just like using GitHub the default way. And so I think that that has been useful as well, to like recognize that, okay, you can try to make these rules to help yourself, but sometimes you go overboard and you make too many rules, and so you need to like reevaluate them sometimes too. The other thing, the last thing I guess, is that open source is much more about people than it is about code. And so you can write the best code in the world and you could be a wonderful, gifted programmer, but if you don't have the social skills to talk to other people, to explain to them why your change is important, then it can lead to problems. And I have failed at this in the past too, from not understanding how other maintainers work. And I've seen it from the other side. A lot of times people will get really upset if you tell them that a patch is not appropriate yet, or this feature isn't ready yet. And I've seen this situation happen before, where someone submits a patch, the maintainer says, this isn't a good fit for the project, thanks but no thanks. And then two things happen. I've seen it go both ways. One is the person says, okay, I can see why you'd say no, but here's why I think you're wrong, let's keep talking about it and working on it. And then they talk about it for a while, and then eventually the maintainer will sometimes say no, but sometimes change their mind, and they'll say, oh, actually, okay, cool, this does make more sense, let's merge this in. The other one is where the person gets really angry and upset, and they start yelling and like being a jerk and saying mean things. And I've never seen a maintainer turn around and say that, oh, hey, when you said that I was a jerk for turning down your patch, you're totally right. Actually, let's merge that in. Like, that doesn't work. So I've learned a lot about how to convince other people that my opinion is right. But you can only do that by being an adult and mature. And I don't want to say nice exactly, but you have to understand where the maintainer is coming from and address their criticisms rather than getting all huffy and complain about it. And I've definitely made that mistake in the past. And I've seen other people make that mistake too. So if your patch gets rejected, that doesn't mean that it's gone forever. Maybe just talk it out and like figure out things. But there's a lot of talking in open source, definitely. Okay, so to follow up briefly, there's somebody asked a question about Git Flow real quick, and then we'll totally move to you, Soner. So what didn't I like or like about Git Flow are the two things. I think that Git Flow is a great release process for an application. So with Git Flow, you have like a release branch, and you have a development branch, and you have feature branches. In many websites, or when you're trying to do continuous deployment, the feature branch and the release branch are the same thing because every commit is intended to be released. So I tend to prefer a more continuous deployment style thing, especially with things like web apps. Whereas the Git Flow approach is much more useful for things like desktop software, where you're going to put out one release every 3 months, and there's a development branch that like you pull off of every once in a while for releases. So I think it's a little too heavyweight for continuous integration, but it's fine if you're not. And I tend to lean towards the continuous integration side, that sort of thing. But sorry for interrupting you. What were you going to ask, Soner? Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah. In fact, my question is really a light one, just something like a magazine question. The Rails core team looks very mysterious from far away, and I wonder if you, as a contributor, have any relationship with Rails core team. And the second question, is there any platforms that people like you meet and have communication?
Yeah. So every project is different, and so Rails is a little special in its regard. It's different than a lot of other projects I've worked on. So I'll cover it second because it's the exception, not the rule. So most of the time, people get together and talk on IRC, on the Freenode network, which is run by Google specifically for managing open source projects. So tab over to my terminal, I am in 1, 2, 3. IRC rooms for various open source projects I work on, and people are talking about what to do in those projects. So I would say that like using IRC is the most common way that I know that people coordinate, and there's usually also a mailing list as well. So the mailing list is sort of for like longer running questions that you want to archive forever, and IRC is good for like conversations and more transient conversation. Although usually IRC is logged, so there's some degree there. But I'd say that's the most common way that people talk to each other. With Rails, there's actually a very complicated multi-step way that there's like contributors that happen. So because Rails is originally written by 37 Signals and Basecamp, the Rails team actually uses a Basecamp project to coordinate between committers, but that's not public. And then there's also a campfire room that is used for committers, and there's also a room that's a little more general. So the way that happens is once you get like 8 or 10 commits in, you get an invite to this campfire room. So it's not totally public, but it's more public than you might expect. And that's just to cut down on the noise. So there is a Ruby on Rails IRC room as well, but it has a ton of people in it, and that there's a good thing about having big rooms, but there's also nice ones and having smaller rooms in that you can like cut out a lot of the noise. So a lot of people come to Ruby on Rails, the IRC, for help, not to work on Rails itself. And so keeping those two things separate is kind of nice. But yeah, I know a lot of the people on the core team just from having talked to them for a while, and I actually don't hang out in that campfire room anymore because I'm sort of slowing down my contributions to Rails because I'm doing more Rust nowadays than Ruby. But I consider a lot of the people on the core team my friends, or at least my coworkers. So I do know all those people for the most part. So yeah, but a lot of it happens through text-only chat, not through voice stuff. I think that they just started instituting actually meetings on Hangouts or something else for the Rails team too, but I haven't attended any of those yet. So
Yeah. Yeah. Steve, like, can you suggest like three or four, like two or three open source Ruby library for like to learn more about Ruby concise code and like maybe the testing part, like two or three for the testing part?
yeah, so I laugh about this because real world projects, often a lot of them are bad, so I don't think they're a great way to learn because they're too concerned with the practical stuff and not enough with the practice. About conciseness of how to write Ruby code, the absolute best thing I can recommend to you is Eloquent Ruby by Russ Olson. It basically is a collection of style guidelines for Ruby stuff, but it's at like a book length, so it goes really deep down into the details. And I would say that that's the number one way to learn how to write idiomatic Ruby code is to go read that book and apply things. There is not enough open source Rails applications in the world, so I actually just started last week, or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, a Rails app that is completely open source. And it's intended, I am planning on using it as an actual product for a friend of mine, so it's trying to be as real world as possible, so it's a little bit interesting. I'm calling that Artisan Assistant, so I'll paste something into the chat room with a link to that GitHub project. You can see how I feel about doing things, and my testing strategy is kind of interesting in there too. I'd use mostly like feature tests as opposed to lower level tests. The last book in terms of testing that I think is really, really good is Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. People call that book Goose. I will link to that too. Growing Object-Oriented. It's got a really, really great example. I think. Sorry. That one is also a really fantastic book for learning about how testing works. I think the important thing to remember with testing is that testing is supposed to make you confident in making changes. So if a test does not allow you to be confident in making changes, you should throw the test away. I don't think 100% test coverage is necessarily mandatory. I don't think that being 100% unit testing is mandatory. For me, it's all about confidence in changing your code. So I tend to actually write a lot more integration tests and then only unit test the complicated bits of my program. Personally, but a lot of people have lots of different opinions on testing. So yeah, I would say that that's the thing. Another one that might be interesting, actually, is a very actually that's probably not true. That one's not that great. But yeah, I would say that once you've like done a bunch of testing on your own, looking at a real-world projects test suite is a nice way to see how people deal with the problems of like real-world stuff. You know, because if you do everything without concern for like being a big project, then it can be really nice. But it's also, there's a tension between shipping software and doing everything perfectly, right? So a lot of times you cut corners because you want to ship, and sometimes that comes back to bite you in the end. And so you just kind of learn about it. Oh, the last thing that's really amazing about testing is working effectively with legacy code. And this book is by Michael Feathers, and it's amazing. It starts off by saying, legacy code is code without tests. And this book actually was wonderful for me because it also does it with like a statically typed language, so its examples are in Java and C. And I was working on a big C project at the time that had no tests whatsoever, and so this book was like perfect for me because I felt I felt despair. It was like, this is a big project, I haven't done C in a while, there's 0 tests, oh my god, what do I do? And this book like really helped me learn how to take a code base that does not have tests or that's ugly or has bad tests and slowly work on making it nicer. So I'm a big fan of books in general, so I actually like to put the books as opposed to projects. So that's the best places to learn, I think.
What do you think about DHH's thoughts on testing?
Let's see how to best put this. I think that DHH's definition of TDD is wrong. When he says TDD is dead, he means unit testing is dead. I think that, first of all, I think that TDD is dead is silly and inflammatory, which is the way that DHH likes to do things. Like, it did lead to a good conversation about testing in the Ruby world, but I think that suggesting that TDD is dead is absurd, because a lot of Rubyists still do TDD, so, like, I don't know, it's kind of silly. Also, I do think that TDD is difficult in Rails, and I think that DHH is right when he says that doing TDD will make your Rails code worse, but I think that's the fault of Rails, not the fault of TDD. So, like, Rails is not designed in a way that makes testing easy, so testing is hard in Rails. But I think that the fault is not TDD's fault. But I do think that writing tests in Rails things is a good idea, and you can do them. And I do think that sometimes examples go too far. But so, for example, in his post, he pointed out a talk by Jim Weirich, and he pointed out some example code. But in that talk, Jim said, this is not the way I would really do it, and assume more complexity here. This code would be bad if you just did it. And so I think that the whole conversation is built on top of a straw man and has gotten everyone saying DHH on Twitter a whole lot more, which is fine. I do think that the discussion with Kent Beck and there was 3 people he talked to, I totally forget. Those video series was really, really good. Martin Fowler, Kent Beck, and DHH. I think those video series was good. I'm glad that we are having a number of conversations about practices in the software world, but I think that the original thesis was a little overly inflammatory and kind of wrong and really annoying. So, such is life.
Hi Steve, Lakshmi here.
What's up?
I'm a big fan of your book, Rust for Rubyists.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, what pulled you towards Rust?
So, the first thing that pulled me towards Rust was that I really, really liked programming languages, and so I try to learn lots of new ones because I think that it's really interesting. Like, it's a part of computer science that I really enjoy. Secondly, when a couple Christmases ago, I was back home at my mom's house, and I was hanging out kind of bored because I come from a small town and I live in big cities now, so I always find going home to be a little bit boring because it's a cattle farm, so there's like literally nothing going on. Now I'm in New York City, so New York City to cattle farm is like very different environments, right? So I was like hanging out on the internet, and I saw Rust 0.5 released, and I went, oh, cool, I heard about Rust, but I've never learned it. I wonder what Rust is about. So I read the release announcement, and it said, Rust is a fast, statically typed language built for concurrency and safety. And I went, that sounds like the exact opposite of Ruby. Those are the 3 things that Ruby is really terrible at: types, speed, and concurrency. So I thought, if I learn this language, I will learn a lot. So I decided to dive into it. And then when I was learning it, I realized that the documentation was terrible. And so I said, this is a good opportunity for me to practice my writing. And so I wrote Rust for Rubyists basically as I learned Rust. I just wrote down what I learned as I learned it. And I think it came out pretty okay. But the other thing that really drew me to Rust was that I had not done low-level programming since college. So in college, my friends and I were working on an operating system. And that's very different than working on a Rails app, right? So I had not done, I'd not thought about pointers or stack versus heap allocation or any of those low-level details in a very, very, very long time. And I kind of wanted to get back to it because I missed it. So those 2 things were what really drew me into Rust, was a love for programming languages, learning something that's very different than Ruby, and being interested in systems programming in general. So. Yep.
I wonder if you would consider a session where you walk people through the process of cloning down a couple of your projects and using them.
Yeah.
And I've been looking at your projects, and one strikes me as something that I would love to use, and there's the Sunlight one.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably a fairly easy one to use.
Yeah.
But it would be good to just, I don't know if you even have time to do that now. And you also talked about the assistant, artisan assistant.
Yeah.
And that looks really interesting. Your notes are a little cryptic to someone who is relatively new to Rails and also isn't involved in the project.
Yeah,
It would be really interesting. I mean, it seems like you're promoting this as a way of sharing good coding practices. Am I understanding that correctly?
yeah. So there are just, in general, there are not enough open source Rails apps, and so I want to show me building a real, honest to goodness, not a blog post example production Rails app with all of the mistakes and awkwardness and like things that come up when doing that. But it's definitely not aimed at beginners exactly. It's aimed at existing Rails developers who are curious as to how I do things. So you're probably right. It is maybe a little cryptic for new people. But also, recently my commit messages have gotten worse. My first commit messages were monsters. And the blog posts that I was doing daily at the beginning were more in depth. But lately I've been trying to actually ship a little more, and so I've been busy. I just started my new job at Mozilla and things, so I've gotten a little worse at it. But I would be interested in the future in doing something like that. I don't think that right now I'm like prepared to show off everything that I'm doing or whatever. I prefer to like think about it a little bit before I'm just like, yeah, let's put this together. But I do think that would be a fun exercise. I did just recently publish an article actually on this new website called howistart.org. So I got the second ever article on it. I will paste this into the chat too. But this shows you how I set up a computer with Ruby and how I build a small Ruby gem in tiny steps that is very, very well documented, I hope, and explained for people that are getting into building Ruby gems. So that might be another example of sort of, in the meantime, maybe we can do a future Codementor session about that. But for now, that might be an interesting thing to check out in terms of my workflow and like how I do things.
Oh, and I have a specific question. I've been using GitHub Pages for a number of Leaflet apps. Leaflet is a JavaScript mapping library.
Okay.
And I've been kind of maintaining a separate master and GitHub page, but I'm always getting way ahead on the GitHub pages because I need to make a quick fix, and I'm just in the G8 pages branch.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering, I noticed that you do host some things on GitHub pages, or at least I think you do.
I do, yeah.
And I'm wondering what you consider to be best practices in doing that.
So there's two things. The first one is if you're just doing JavaScript, like if there's no compilation step to make your page, I actually kill the master branch and I only have a GitHub Pages branch and I make it my standard.
You literally delete the master branch.
Yeah.
I'm afraid of doing that. There's no.
So in Git, the master branch is just a convention. It's not something that is actually true. So you can, this is a bad example. I was like, I have an example for you, but I just moved it to an organization page. So on organization GitHub Pages, the branch is master. But there's at least one of my projects, I forget, where I literally delete the master branch. Git works just fine without having a master branch, and GitHub actually in the admin settings lets you switch what the default branch is. So the other
so
thing
that way when people go to the repository, they'll see the README for the GitHub pages.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's in the admin settings on the project. You can switch it to be GitHub Pages at first. So I would recommend that for a JavaScript project. For a non-JavaScript project or something that needs a compilation step, so like if you have a blog that you run Middleman or you run Jekyll or something, then I do keep a separate master and GitHub Pages branch. But there's a really interesting. I always copy the code from Doco. Is this Ruby port? Or I'm sorry, Rocco. Is this Ruby port of a thing called Doco, and in the Rocco rake file, there's this really interesting bit of code I'll paste this into the chat too, called the update pages branch, and it has a really interesting rake task that basically you work on master and then you run rake pages, and it automatically compiles your thing, switches to your GitHub Pages branch, commits the change, goes back to master, and then undoes all of the like generated stuff. And so I always end up taking that code and copying it around a little bit, and I've used it in multiple places. So checking that out is like, it's sort of complicated. It took me a while to figure out what it was doing and like how it does it, but you can do that too, and that will help with like you only work on master and then you automatically update GitHub Pages every so often or whatever. So that's another thing that I've done stuff with too.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. It's a little complicated, and I think that it's one of my problems with GitHub Pages is that it's a little overly complicated in places, but I do like using it, and it works out. Once you're done, especially for, oh, I know a good example of when I actually killed a master branch. I will paste it in the chat. Some of my talks in HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and so I put those up on GitHub Pages, which is really wonderful because you can just view my talk rather than software and stuff. And so those ones I end up always having an actual just the GitHub Pages branch. So here is one I'll paste it in the chat of a Rust for Rubyist talk I gave, and it just has GitHub Pages, and that's it, no master, and it just works.
Oh, cool. And so you didn't even need to change the setting there.
Yeah.
You just deleted the master and
Well,
made it the only branch.
GitHub will not let you delete the master branch unless you switch it to GitHub Pages first, because it says, hey, this is your default branch. You're not allowed to delete it. So when you try to delete the branch from the command line, it won't let you. But if the first thing you push up is GitHub Pages only, then you don't need to change the setting.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, and what do you use for slides? Is this Reveal?
It's Reveal, yeah. I'm really big into Reveal, and I just write it by hand. I use this HTML on its own. I don't use any complicated pre-compilation step or whatever. I usually just copy the default Reveal project. A lot of them even have the Reveal README sometimes because I forget to remove it. So, yeah. There's another question in the chat. So, with no computer science background and working daily with PHP and Ruby, what is the best self-education in languages like Rust? So, the big thing about learning Rust, if you don't have a computer science background, is learning C first will help you understand why Rust is necessary. So, Rust's advantage over different systems programming languages is that it is safer. So, for example, you cannot do what's called a buffer overflow in Rust, but you can in languages like C. So unless you've programmed in C or C++ first, you may not appreciate why Rust is important and useful. So I would encourage you to learn a systems programming language like C first, maybe, until my documentation is ready. Once my docs are written, then I hope to be able to have like a better intro to systems programming for people that have not done it before, but that is a couple months off. So learning C would be a good first step. And I really, really, really enjoy Zed Shah's Learn C the Hard Way. I'll paste this into the chat too. And it is a book that's specifically designed to teach you C if you've never programmed it before. And I think that it's really, really fantastic in terms of learning modern C. Some of the classic books that people recommend for learning C, like, oh, you should pick up K&R's book on C, the Kerrigan and Ritchie, the C programming language. And that book is full of stuff from the 70s, which we've learned better now. So it's an important book. I have a copy on my shelf. I love it to death, but as a historical artifact, not as a modern way of learning C programming. The other nice thing about learning C first is that you can use C in your PHP and Ruby gems as well. Gems and packages, so it'll also help you speed up your Ruby stuff sometimes. But I would say that getting a familiarity with C will help you understand what Rust is, because right now all the documentation assumes that you know low-level programming stuff already, and it'll get better over time. But right now, because Rust is still so young, there's just not a whole lot of stuff for new people yet. Okay, so another question from the chat. How do you think the main reason of an open source project gets traction? So sometimes it's frustrating that hours get no attention, but a toy will get quite popular. If I knew the answer to this question, I would work in marketing and I would make billions of dollars. You just can never know what's going to be popular and what's not. I would like to think that things that are useful get popular, but that's not always necessarily the case. And so I think that I think that if you can demonstrate to someone why your thing is valuable, then people will like to use it and it'll get out there. But I think that marketing is a separate skill from programming, and so if you learn how to do marketing, then your projects will get more attention, and it's also a snowball effect, right? So I have tons of Twitter followers, so every random project that I link to will see more attention than someone who has 10 Twitter followers, just by the nature of what that is. That's why I think approaching things like Ruby Weekly is really important, because Peter does not care if you were a popular programmer or not. He cares if your project is interesting and useful. And that's a great way to and that's what I used to do as well, to get attention on the things that I was doing. So people that write for blogs are always looking for more things to blog about. And so, reaching those media outlet people is easier than you might think, and is a great way to get lots of attention. I should say the Ruby 5 podcast is also really fantastic as well. It covers Ruby in 5 minutes, like what happened this week, and they're always interested in new projects and what's going on. So talking to those people would be great as well. And if they don't care the first time, just tell them about the next one. It's sometimes it'll be a busy week, and they'll say, "Oh, this isn't a good week, but maybe next week or something." So, persistence wins at the end. It's a long, slow haul. It's not a you don't just all of a sudden one day find your project being massively successful. It's about continuously working on it forever. Yeah. So what is my current setup? I have actually already written about this too. There's a blog called Uses This. I will paste a link to it. And basically, the whole point of this blog is to interview programmers about what their setups are. So you can find the text version over there. But basically, right now, I'm typing this on a ThinkPad X1 Carbon. And the last revision of it, the new one, is really, really great. The one I have, the screen is a little crappy, but the new one fixed that problem, and it's much, much better. I use Linux on everything, so I'm currently using Ubuntu Linux, nothing super special, just the latest Ubuntu. I used to use more fancy Linuxes, but then I accidentally deleted half of my system stuff one day because I was experimenting, and so I made my computer not turn on anymore, so I just use Ubuntu now because I'm sick of doing that, but Ubuntu works really well and is pretty simple. I use Vim for everything, which is not necessarily appropriate for beginners, but if you invest the time, it can be really powerful, so I prefer Vim. If I didn't use Vim, I would use Sublime Text, which is nice and easy for people to get that don't want to spend hours and hours learning their text editor. There's a joke I always enjoy, which is, I've been using Vim for years, I still haven't figured out how to quit it yet, which happens with Vim. So I would say Sublime is a really great text editor if you don't want to learn the arcane Vim stuff, but I've been very happy with Vim. And I tend to keep my computers they're very boring. I don't do a lot of configuration. People are like, "Hey Steve, can I see your .files repo?" I'm like, "I don't have a .files repo." And they're like, "Why not?" I'm like, "Well, because my configs are 3 lines. I think if I looked at my Vim config right now, let's see, I will just actually check it out. .vimrc. Yeah, so I actually don't have a vimrc on this computer right now. No such file or directory. I should have a couple of lines in there, but I've been lazy and I haven't modified it. I like keeping my setup very vanilla because if I pair with other people, or if I'm teaching people, or if I get a new computer, I use a different computer, I don't have to worry about replicating a complicated setup across a number of computers. I just use the defaults, and sometimes the defaults are awkward, and you could be more productive by messing with your tools a whole lot, but I prefer to it's sort of like a cook that only uses basic ingredients. I prefer to do that rather than learn about complicated, complex ingredients. So it's sort of the same approach I take with software: is use simple stuff and just don't worry about your tools too much. They're not as big of a deal. But yeah, I try to stick to 100% free and open source software where possible. So that's why I'm using Linux. That's why I'm on a ThinkPad. It's just something I prefer.
So guys, any other questions for Steve? Well, I guess not. Steve, any final last words for the people in the audience?
I would say the last words is remember that we're all in this together. Everyone is bad at writing software, including me. We're all just figuring out what to do with ourselves, and we're all just trying to get better. So have lots of fun writing software, and let's help each other out and work on some open source. And it's always good to be nice to each other and enjoy working on stuff. So let's try to keep that in mind.
Yes.
I was on mute for a moment, and I'm curious about your Twitter music score.
You broke up a little bit there. My Twitter music?
Yeah, your Twitter profile image.
Oh, my profile image on Twitter. Let's see, which one is it right now? Oh, so that actually, that is a T-shirt from an event that I did not attend. It's from this thing called Fashion Hack that I got the T-shirt through other means. Oh, the image, the background image. That thing. Wrong thing. Not my photo, but the background image. That is the introductory image from my favorite book in the world.
The piano piece?
Yeah. So it is from this book called 1,000 Plateaus, which is a book by Gilles Deleuze, French philosopher extraordinaire. And it is representing how music, we like to pretend that music is this very formulaic thing, but it's actually full of heart and is complicated and intermingles with other pieces of music. And so, like, if you look at one sheet piece of music with one part, you don't understand how the orchestra plays, right? So looking at one part is not actually understanding the music. You need this interconnected, intertwined, the word he uses is rhizome, to understand the music. And also that philosophy is much more like music, and that you should, like, listen to the parts that make you feel things, ignore the parts you find boring, listen to pieces you enjoy over and over again, and try out new things every once in a while. So that's actually the intro image from the very front of the book.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Yeah. Cool.
Steve, sorry, there's a few more questions from the audience.
Yeah.
So Mike would like to ask you about how do you learn how to read others' code to improve your coding skills, such as line by line or high-level understanding of their logic?
Yeah. So the solution to this is just to read a lot of code. So if you read code and then you read more code and then you read more code, eventually you'll see the similarities between things. This is why Rubyists are so focused on style, is because the language lets you do anything that you want, like anything that you want. And so the only way we can understand each other's code is if we follow these same style guidelines. So as you read more and more code, you'll pick up on what common styles look like, and you'll be able to understand it more easily because it will look similar to the things that people have done previously. So what I tend to do is I tend to try to find some code that I use and, like, go pick some random part of it and then read through it and try to understand it. And it can take a while. There's actually an exercise from learning effectively or working effectively with legacy code that I really enjoy, which is you take a piece of paper and you draw a circle and you write the class name in the circle, and then you write little circles in all the methods inside, and you draw lines between every method that calls every other method, and you sort of map out visually what that looks like. And the cool thing about doing that is that it actually enables you to see, in working effectively with legacy code, the reason why I suggest that you should do this is that you can see how tangled and complicated your code is, because if there's lots of lines that crisscross each other and if it's very complicated, you know your code is really complicated. Whereas if it's very simple, then you can actually, you can see that the lines are very simple. So I actually did this for some code in Ruby Gems I was trying to understand. I don't know what the name of it is specifically from the book. I don't have the book handy, or I would go check it out for you. But here are two images of me actually doing this for code that's in Ruby Gems, because Ruby Gems is really complicated, tangled, old legacy code. And so, in these two things, I was able to sort of show what these dependencies are. And you can see that one of them is kind of clean and one of them is kind of messy. And so drawing that out is something that I have found very helpful in trying to understand other code. I'm a very visual learner, which is funny because I'm terrible at drawing. But, like, by drawing things out on the screen or on the page with paper has definitely helped me understand other people's code significantly. Okay, so last question. What is one book that every computer science person should read, or maybe two books? It's really hard to pick one. I would say that it matters what your objective is, but I would think my favorite book for becoming a better programmer is the book that I'm totally blanking out on now. What is it? Oh my God. It's free from MIT. It's about working in Lisp. Oh man, wow! I'm just totally blanking on like the most famous book ever. Scheme programming. Huh?
SICP.
SICP, thank you. Yes, the structure and interpretation of computer programs. That book will blow your mind, and it will also help you write better code in other languages. It's free online, or you can buy a copy of it if you want. But it was originally used to teach MIT's Introduction to Computer Programming classes from like the 60s until I think 4 or 5 years ago when they switched from Scheme to Python. But the cool thing about that book is that it helps you understand the nature of computation rather than programming specifically. And for example, you don't even get to variables until chapter 7 or 8. And it's so funny when you've read it as an experienced programmer because you get the whole way through and they're like, now it's time to talk about variables. And you're like, wait a minute, I haven't used any variables yet. Whoa, that's totally ridiculous. But it's really, really good. And working through the exercises in your favorite programming language will also like really, really help you level up as a programmer. And I think that it's really, really fantastic for helping you get better at understanding what computers are about, and which will help make you a better programmer in whatever language that you choose. I would say that's the #1 book that I would recommend for sure. As far as other ones, I've mentioned most of my other favorite books already for computer programming. I think that all of them are good, and it sort of depends on what you're trying to get out of it. But I think that's the best book in general purpose that programmers should read.
Wow, that was pretty awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess we're running out of time. So Steve, thank you so much for the great office hours. I'm sure a lot of people have learned tremendously from your insight. So thanks a lot for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for all your great questions. They were awesome.
Yeah, thank you. So this session will be available on Codementor, and going forward, we'll hopefully that we can invite Steve to another office hours again in the next few months or so.
Yeah. Bye.
All right, thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate this. Take care.